by parsing part of the title. When I say Karuppadanna, it's not an imaginary village, it is a real village, although it's unlikely any of you or many of you have heard it or heard of it. It's near Kodungalur. It's a walking distance literally in my school days from Kodungalur. And it's a small village dissected by the State Highway 22, on either side of which is the village. It is, has been even then, in the 60s is when my awareness of the village really blossoms. I must say that I've never lived in Kerala, either in my childhood or my adult life. My parents were living outside Kerala, in Bombay, Calcutta and Madras. And so I naturally studied there, I was there. And yet, Karuppadanna particularly, Karuppadanna was Kerala for me, was my summer holidays or any break destination, and was constitutive, if you like, of my Kerala alter ego. I mean, my locus in Kerala, my interest in Kerala, and as time went along, my great passion for Kerala began with Karuppadanna. So it's a place of great significance for me. It's my global village in the McLuhan sense of the term, not because time and space have been condensed there. Karuppadanna, I think, like perhaps many villages in other parts of Kerala, hasn't really topographically or in terms of its physical delineation or attributes changed much over the years. When I go back there, of course, the people have changed, the technologies are different, and yet there's a look and feel of the sameness about it for the last 45 to 50 years. But it's a global village because the global village of McLuhan, as you know, is often construed as a sheer, simplistically, a condensation of time and space with technology, with electronic technology, particularly in his case. However, what he, I think, meant by it and what's underwritten is the fact that technology, that the essence of technology is not technological, particularly for McLuhan. That's why he talks about the medium itself becoming the message. The essence of technology is cultural, it is social, it is certainly political. And the essence of technology in this case, when he calls it the global village, that the world will become a global village, is that there will be a sense of familiarity like in a village. In a village, you know everybody else. If a stranger enters the village, he or she sticks out like a sore thumb, right? Immediately noticed. And so there's that sense of familiarity, that sense of, an assurance of familiarity with not just your context, but with the people there. And it's in that sense that I use the term global village as far as Karuppadanna itself is concerned. And in fact, it went on from being my global village to my Twitter handle now. My Twitter handle is Karuppadanna, and many people must be wondering what this word means. So it is really how important it is for me. So the technology-mediated familiarity is certainly a leitmotif in what I'm going to be, talking about in terms of the changing, shall we say, vistas of culture over the decades. Let me begin with 1960s and Karuppadanna, as I said, and my engagement with my, shall we say, sense of awakening to the possibilities of communication and so on, which were fairly early on in my career, because even in high school or in early college, I was engaging with the media. I was initially writing about films, not in terms of reviews as much as textual analysis, structural analysis, deep theory, and so on cinema. And so summer holidays in Karuppadanna have been, in that sense, very definitive in many ways. And it was there that, and in fact, I always had to be wrested away after this break to go back to the drudgery of school, wherever I was, in Mumbai or in Calcutta or in Madras later on. And there were so many things that have resonances now, apart from the usual layout of the place and so on. It's a dominantly the demographic is dominantly Muslim, so it's almost predominantly Muslim village, and with very few Hindu families or Nair families, and we were in one of those. There was never ever a suggestion of a religious, shall we say, division. Forget about strife. There was no dissimilarity. Religion was not an issue. I mean, there was a temple, there were mosques, but religion was not something anyone wore on their sleeves, or on his or her sleeves, and religion was not an issue of contention. It was never a bone of contention. As far as back as I can remember, and even now that I'm in touch with the place, it continues to be something that's taken for granted. It's something that is uh, at ease. You know, you're not self-conscious about the religious identity at all. Uh, the same can't be said about caste. So caste is an issue, particularly in the Hindu, segment of the small Hindu groupings there. There was a caste awareness, but never really a religious awareness. Um, there was there were the usual characters. There was this character called Uduman Kuti, who later on became a media reference for me when I saw TV Chandran's Ormagalundayirikkanam Basi in that film is Uduman Kuti to the T. I have a feeling Chandran must have run into Uduman Kuti somewhere, because including the hairstyle and the way he wore a shirt and the flamboyance and so on, it was Uduman Kuti. Uduman Kuti may not have been a party worker or a politicized person like Basi. He was probably just an antisocial element, because one always heard about him getting into fracas and wielding a knife. But these were all heroics for us at that time. There was a romanticism of a character we used to call Tale Langadi. My first exposure, if you like, to the market and to business, to merchant capitalism of a very, very miniature order. We used to carry a basket on his head of all the wares that a household needed and go from house to house selling that. He was almost like a familiar person in each of those households. Tale Langadi, because he carried a angadi in his head, literally speaking. He was also important because every once in a while he'll collect old bank notes which had torn or would not be in currency, would not be taken, would not be usable, and he'd collect it from all the houses in the village and travel to Madras, where the Reserve Bank of India regional office was situated, and exchange this for fresh currency and come and return it to the households for a very, very small service charge. And when Modi demonetized currency, my first thought was about this person who used to keep currency alive and kicking and valid long after its physical attributes had rendered it rather useless. There was that kind of, there was the postman Vishwanathan and Vishwanathan Nair actually, who in the school in Karuppadanna, government school in Karuppadanna, used to come there every evening and distribute the letters. The letters didn't reach your home. You would send someone or you went yourself. And I went many times when I was there to collect the letters that came to us or were addressed to us. And the postman would call out the names and distribute. Most of them would be postcards because that was the easiest. I don't even know if postcards exist now. And sometimes inland letters. And these were addressed. And what was fascinating about this exercise was not just that you knew the names of the people who, again and again, who came to collect those letters. You almost knew every household in the village. You also knew what was going on in each household, because this was a pre-total literacy Kerala. So there were many households in which there were just the mother or the wives and the sons or the working member of the family was working outside of Kerala, not necessarily in the Gulf yet, but in other parts of India. And letters would come, and it was also the postman's job after calling out the name of the addressee to read the contents of the letter aloud, so that everyone knew what the problems of a household were. And that again, there was no shock or there was no sense of no self-consciousness about privacy. It's a contrast to our ultra sensitivity. Of course, we need to be ultra sensitive about it now. To privacy, every time you use a credit card or every time you're clicking on the computer, even when you're saying like or following someone, you're actually revealing yourself. You're adding to the data, the gargantuan data mechanism that runs the whole the wheels of this whole of the new commodity that is the internet. So there was that sense of lack of privacy, which was wonderful, which is almost romantically wonderful in one sense. There was, of course, the intrusions from the outside world every once in a while. And the post office, by the way, I mean, just as a diversion quickly, has been a very important cultural institution as well. I mean, certainly has been a milestone, a big milestone in the development of journalism, media, for instance. The penny post and the post office. Post office is seen as a nodal center of spreading colonialism. The British used the post office literally. Post office is also a center of censorship, where you could see who was writing what to whom, and arrive at the kind of profiles, individual profiles, that are done today with far greater sophistication by algorithms that drive cyberspace and the internet. And so the other kind of, shall we say, interventions from outside were occasionally when something tremendous happened, like in 1964, I think in May. It was summertime, so it was May, when Nehru died. It was a sensation in the village. I mean, it was first heard in the tea shop, where there was a radio all the time on, All India Radio, and then it spread like wildfire, and people were just agog with excitement and rushed out of their houses. Not that they could do anything, but just shocked by the event of the first Prime Minister of India, Nehru's death. And so that was, in this sense, this was my first engagement with culture, and this to me seems to be the culture that was defined by Raymond Williams when he calls it, in his own bucolic, rural, charming, sylvan sense, he calls it the ordinary and the everyday culture. Your physical experience of that culture, without it being a performative event, without it being an event, it's something that you engaged with, something that you ingested, something that you lived with, something that you breathed, and it was constitutive of your persona, of your personality. It defined your relationships, your interrelationships in the context that you lived in. So it was for me of course, I didn't know Raymond Williams then, but later on, when I thought about Karuppadanna, I think about Raymond Williams' functional definition of culture in that sense. So much for Karuppadanna. There's a lot. I could spend an entire hour speaking about Karuppadanna, but that's not the theme of this. That's just one small part of the title of this talk. So 60s was, in other words, for me, the experiential exposure to culture in the very ordinary in inverted commas, as Williams defined it, everyday sense of it. It was far more important and far more impinging on my personality than the big portion of my time that I spent in the urban areas in the city, where I went to college, when I went to school, about which my memories are scant, literally speaking. Whereas these memories are like the asparagus of my memory. I can remember them. They are fresh. They are mint fresh. And that's what's fascinating about the cultural context of Karuppadanna. Moving to the next decade, there's a big shift when you move to from the 1960s to the 1970s in my case. And by then I had shifted from Delhi to Calcutta to Madras, where I spent the bulk of my life, and I continue to live in Madras. I've been a Madras person since the late 1960s, actually. And then the shift takes place to the first medium, that is cinema. That's when I started writing about cinema. As I said, I started looking at cinema. Initially, of course, not just initially, for a long time, this was exclusively the new cinema. The new wave was big. It was already big in the 60s, but 70s was when I think it was slapping our shows. The French new wave, and then the European new wave. And there was a breed of filmmakers in Kerala who were making films through the 70s and 80s. And I was looking at their films even before I got to see them, whether it was people like Kumaran or Padmarajan or Bakar, John Abraham, K.R. Mohan, Chinda Ravi, of course, and many others. And there was a sense of identity with this newness, this new idiom, this new purposive cinema, this new cinema, which was not just a trivial or a mediocre representation of life, but a representation with a spin, a representation which had insights, a representation which looked beyond the surface and looked at deep surface phenomena and so on. And so for me, as a student of cinema, as a very early student of cinema at that time, I found this engagement with cinema very fascinating. And the decade was also eventful in the sense that towards the middle of the latter part of the decade, already the shift from industrialism was, a whiff of it was in the air. We were already reading about Alvin Toffler, Alvin Toffler and his almost science fictional imagination to us, to us in those days of computer using societies in the future. Or Daniel Bell and his concept of the shift from blue collarism to white collarism, the shift from factory floor working labor to white collar workers, which eventually became the IT professionals and so on. But the service industry, literally, from manufacturing to service industry initially. IT comes much later. So Daniel Bell's white collarism from blue collarism, Alvin Toffler, these were names which engaged our attention, certainly engaged my attention, and sought them out and read about it. It was also a time of very dramatic shifts taking place in the landscape and the topography of Kerala, also the cultural landscape of Kerala, because the Gulf boom had begun around the mid, 1973 on, so on it started. And people were going, before that, Kerala was always a diasporic community. Malayalis are always diasporic. Before that, you had people going to Ceylon, as it was called, or Kuwait, as Gulf was amorphously called, or Persia, as it was called, but this Gulf boom with oil and all that it meant, and the whole transition of the Gulf from camel to the Cadillac, as it's called, had its huge spillover effect, had its huge percolation effect into Kerala, and the landscape changed dramatically. And this was also taking place. And I was to actually witness that at close quarters, because one of the first things I did when towards the end of the 1970s, I was already engaging with the electronic media, that is television. I was reading news on television. There was no national news then. You had regional kendras. You had Madras, Delhi, Calcutta, Bombay, Hyderabad. There were centers like that. And you had regional news. You had regional news in the regional language as well as in English. And so my formal working relationship with the media was with Doordarshan as a news presenter. Then I went on to do documentaries. And one of the first things I was assigned to do was the shifts that were taking place in Kerala because of the Gulf boom, which enabled me to travel from the northernmost point of Kerala up until Trivandrum and look at what was changing. Not just the houses that came up, not just the consumption patterns that were changing, not just the consumer habits that were changing, not just the conspicuous consumption that was evident, but also culturally what was happening and the awareness and the whole consumer durables kind of revolution that was taking place. So much so, as you know, Kerala is even today perhaps a crucible for consumer appetites, for consumer research studies. Trichur, I think, used to be for a long time a crucible for consumer studies across India. So this was a very interesting phase for the 1970s. So there was cinema and there was electronics. Now I want to step back and just and create a template so that there's a context to it. Frederick Jameson, the famous Marxist philosopher, scholar, talks about three cultural moments, in civilizational moments. He talks about the 1840s, which he characterizes as the era of merchant capitalism. And the 1890s is the era of monopoly capitalism. And the 1940s of multinational capitalism or transnational capitalism. And he says each of these eras have their own cultural attributes and the instruments of those cultural expressions. For instance, he talks about the 1840s and the merchant capitalism's cultural expression being realism. If you looked at the novels, if you looked at stage plays, if you looked at cultural forms of cultural expression, realism would be the theme, right? The dominant theme would be realism. And the expression of realism was photography. So that was when photography became both art and craft and became an important form of an instrumentation of realism. And when you shift from 1840s to the 1890s to monopoly capitalism, its expression is modernism, and the instrumentation of modernism, or the mediation, or the media that expresses modernism best, was the cinema. Cinema, as you know, was a synthesis of all the arts. Cinema and the modernity of cinema, which is why cinema is essentially a medium of modernity. And then from there, when you shift to the 1940s to multinational capitalism, its expression was postmodernism. So imagine what old hat postmodernism. We still say POMO as if it's something just happened just yesterday, but it's as old as that. And the cultural expression of postmodernism was electronics, right? Electronics. So that's the electronic television. So this is the context that I'm talking about here as well. At the end of the 1970s and early turn of the into the 1980s, and it's important to continue with the Frederick Jameson template that after postmodernism, as we know, we have not had a movement of that nature, of that size, of that scale. You can talk about postmodernism, or you can talk about post-structuralism, you can talk about post-truth, and so on and so forth. But there hasn't been a concerted, orchestrated movement with attributes that are very definitive, with characteristics that are very, very singular, ever since. In other words, there has been a kind of stasis, and cultural theorists have pointed out to this. So while there has been a exponential growth and a runaway growth, if you like, in the mediation of culture, in the forms of mediation, the instrumentation of culture or politics or society. From electronics, you moved quickly to digitization. Electronics to digitization was another quantum leap, if you like. There hasn't been a similar shift in terms of forms of cultural expression. And that is, I think, an important, and shall we say, mismatch, or an important, kind of an analogous situation, if you like, which we might like to keep in our minds. And so, moving on from the 1970s to the 1980s, you have a combination of the cinematic and the electronic by then, as I just indicated. I was, of course, involved with Doordarshan and doing a lot of not just news, but also a lot of documentation and documentaries. The Gulf boom, the whole documentation of the Gulf, a 1-hour documentary that I produced, was for me a labor of love, and a very fulfilling labor of love. I remember that was also a time when you had forms of a religious renaissance, rearing their head. Even in the 80s, one could see that. One of my personal experiences has to do with what Balachandran Chuldikadu was referring to last time, not just this Ayyappa Puja, the processions that took place. He was talking about Swami Chinmayananda as a phenomenon of renaissance of Hinduism, and his Gita Jnana, the big the assembly that he used to hold, where thousands of people would attend. He was an orator of great skill, where he would be talking about the Mahabharata. And I used to attend those lectures here in Chennai. He used to do them in Madras, not Chennai, in Madras. And I have been through an entire sessions of those lectures, and I found them very fascinating, because he would disguise very cleverly the religious, shall we say, subterfuge. There's a kind of religious subterfuge there. And it took me a direct encounter with him. I haven't spoken about this too much in the public. In the 1980s, one of my important assignments was to do an interview with Swami Chinmayananda when he came to Madras in those days. And this was a commission from the headquarters in Delhi. And I was specifically asked to do it. And I was to go and meet him where he was staying in Madras, discuss the scope of the interview, and then he'd come to our studio and we'll do the interview. And this bears, I think, narration, because it's an interesting and a telling anecdote. So he used to stay in the house of a person, I won't mention the name, here in Nungambakam, in a house in Nungambakam. And I went there one afternoon, as was appointment, to see him, to have a preliminary chat. And the next day he was supposed to come to our Doordarshan studio. And when I what I see is Swami Chinmayananda sitting there with all his disciples. His disciples are called chayas, as in shadows, or shades or chayas. And middle, young mothers, because their husbands are all out working, and their children. That was the overwhelming part of it. And he had this small child on his lap who was a bit thin, if you like, a young, very nice looking, beautiful boy who was in awe of the situation already because everybody's, bending and prostrating before the man. And when I entered, what I heard him telling this child is, but why are you looking like that poor Jesus Christ on the cross? Why are you so skinny? Doesn't your mother give you bone vita? Doesn't she give you Horlicks? I don't know which of these, one of these, Bonvita or Horlicks, whichever was the food then, health food, very popular health. And instead of shock, there was a twitter of, kind of endorsement in this assemblage of chayas. And something in me snapped. And I said, this is the man I've been admiring as an exponent of the Bhagavad Gita. And this is this is a reality check. This is what the man is. And this is what it's all about. So, so the danger of God-men, which is, I think, even more so today than then, as a cultural phenomenon, the danger of religious events, saptahams and discourses taking over the engagement columns in newspapers, and then eventually becoming in your face, so much so that there's no other engagement, in the public realm. If you look at intimation of what's happening around you, cultural activity around you. And I don't need to mention names now. I've had a fairly uncomfortable engagement much more recently with another God-man, and so it's all more of the same. They are different in degree, not in kind, and they are, I think, dangerous because they have substituted the public sphere. They have taken over the public sphere. They have substituted the role of the public intellectual. So much so that if there is any issue now, I'm going ahead of myself, but I might as well complete this process of thought. Whether it is atomic power, India's or Jallikattu, or the India-China standoff, or demonetization, it's ridiculous that news practitioners, media men, rush to Godmen for their opinion. What do they know about it? I mean, I can understand if you ask them about spiritual issues, you can ask them about religious issues, or you ask them about how do you preserve your soul as much as your body, or some such thing. But asking them about, when there are domain experts about issues on education or science or other matters on which there are far more qualified people. So there's a kind of appropriation of the public space by this process. And that's as much a cultural phenomenon. I think it's a cultural religious phenomenon which continues to take off from where Balachandra Chulikar left off. I think that's become far more accentuated and dangerous today than, or as much as it was when he was referring to it. And so, and in the 80s, then there was also there was a discourse on the left radicalism and so on. In the end of 1970s, I had the occasion to act in a film called Iniyum Marichittillatha Nammal, which means we who are not yet dead. And people used to joke about it, saying it should be called we Iniyum Vadichittillatha Nammal. In other words, we who have not yet shaven our beards. Because everyone in that film, everyone who came on screen had a beard. So it was about the discourse. It was an intellectual discourse more than a film. And it was work in progress. It was a workshop. I think the process of it was far more interesting than the product that emerged. The product that emerged, I think, was significant. It was a film made by Chinda Ravi, whom I befriended with that film. And through the making of this film was my first exposure to all the important cultural, shall we say, figures of the day. Because either they were involved with the film in one form or the other, or they'd come visiting at the shooting site in Calicut. Whether it was Kadamalita Ramakrishnan, who of course acted in it, or Chandran, or it was architects, or poets, writers, scores of them. And I couldn't have managed to meet all of them, in the space of 1 or 2 weeks or 3 weeks in any other context. And that was, I think, a very, very instructive and for me very, very enduring, very, very memorable experience. uh, and in the 70s, towards the 80s, then I also had to, I went as a West Asia correspondent to the Hindu, where I was able to look at the other side of the coin, the obvious side of the coin of the Gulf boom in Kerala. That was a story of a change for the better in the lives of the people who are living back home. And when I go there, I see what are the conditions in which the money is earned to be sent back home. The huge repatriation from the Gulf that became almost a parallel economy, if you like, as far as Kerala is concerned. The struggle, the conditions in which they worked, particularly the labor camps and the construction industry, and the stepmotherly treatment they got from the Indian missions, the fairly poor quality of life, none of which would or could be reported in the media. And even many of my stories too didn't find the light of day, because in the balance sheet, there was a question of whether by reporting this, you're killing the golden goose, right? So there were considerations like that. And yet you knew that there was injustice happening day in and day out. And this was a labor surplus value of a very, very punitive kind. And that was being poured back into Kerala. And you also found a sense of the other culture, the diasporic culture, eventually, as you find towards the end of the 80s, you find by then it's developed a diasporic culture, a kind of writing that comes from the Gulf, poetry that comes from the Gulf. Of course, also lesser varieties of skits or drama or stuff like that, which are engaged, which are happening there. Not of a very enduring quality, like say in Tamil and Malaysia, for instance. The Tamils in Malaysia, it would seem that their Tamil, their language itself has frozen at the point that they left Chennai or Tamil Nadu to go there, because they speak an old kind of Tamil. Of course, here, these were temporary transient laborers, because there's nobody settling down in the Gulf for good. They work for a few years, for a short time, or even for longer years, and always come back. They're always coming back home. There's no question of getting citizenship and staying there. So there was that difference. There was a kind of anomie. At the same time, there was a shift in the form of the culture, which I found fascinating, and I also wrote about it a couple of times as part of my dispatches from the Gulf. But unbeknownst to me, and perhaps to many of us at that time, there were big shifts taking place in the technology of information. By the mid-1980s, as we know, the direct broadcast satellite revolution had taken place. Until then, you had terrestrial broadcasting. You had terrestrial stations from which, say, like Doordarshan, state broadcasters would terrestrial low-power transmitters, and it was relayed. Signals were relayed from transmission tower to transmission tower. It was all terrestrial, on the ground. As against that, you had satellite broadcasting happening, and DBS technology, or the direct broadcast satellite technology, enabled a satellite to be put up there, and in the footprint of the satellite, which imagine it's like a torch, and in the light arc of the torch, anyone could receive the signal of the satellite and distribute that signal. That's how the first Gulf War was covered by the CNN, and that's how the cable and satellite revolution happens in India. How these small cable operators in big cities like Bombay or Delhi, particularly Bombay, just connected homes, flats, apartments with copper coaxial cables. They set up a big, huge C-band dish antenna, received the signals from this DBS satellite to the CNN, and you saw the Gulf War. That was, I think, the first big exposure in terms of DBS technology that was available, and we knew that that was a game changer, and that was when. And how big a game changer was it? I think I learned about it when I later that decade towards '89, before the collapse of the Berlin Wall. I happened to go to the Soviet Union to look at the transition that was taking place there, the breakup of the Soviet Union after Gorbachev, and it's moving into Russia and its satellites, and also the collapse of the Berlin Wall and how the East and West Berlin merge. And you found that, for instance, because of the DBS satellite technology, both in East and West Berlin, they were watching the same serial, Dallas. Now, Dallas is an important serial. It is an American serial. It was a global serial. It was the first big global serial, if you like. It was seen all over the world. And its content was, of course, big families in the USA who lived in luxurious lifestyle, with homes with swimming pools and huge cars and parties all the time. And there was a German version of it which was seen in West Berlin, in West Germany. And with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, or even before the Berlin Wall, when I traveled to East Germany, people were setting up these surreptitious dishes and getting these signals and seeing them in their homes in East Berlin. And that was how the revolution of rising expectations took place in East Berlin. It wouldn't really be an exaggeration to say that this, a serial like Dallas uh, contributed in no small measure to expediting or to hastening the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Because people then said, this is how the rest of the world lives. Because as you know, one of the problems of communism or socialism in East Berlin then, and even later, was the short-sighted view of handling information technology and trying to protect information, thinking that the gains of the revolution could be protected by protecting information from outside eroding into it. That didn't work. It became counterproductive, as we know. And the Berlin Wall collapsed because people thought this is how the rest of the world was. They forgot for a moment that they had all the essential comforts of life. They had free housing, they had free education, they had free pension, they had free gas, they had free heating. All of this didn't have to be paid for in socialist East Germany, but they didn't have the freedom to say what they liked. This is what they thought. They thought they couldn't live the life that people in the serial Dallas lived. They thought this is how capitalism lives. Capitalism is a process where you're laughing your way to the bank every day. And this delusion played no small part in the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Small wonder that the French culture minister said Dallas is cultural imperialism. I mean, he's not a communist. He may be a socialist at heart. He said Dallas is Jacques Lang. He said Dallas is cultural imperialism. So there was that. And at home in India, what was happening is I had come back from, and I was with PTI TV, and there were many things happening there. Before that, as you know, the Rajiv Gandhi, a young modern Prime Minister of India, was shall we say, gallivanting, was with soft Hindutva. Was doing experiments to try and get the soft saffron votes for the Congress. And in the process, I think he began the process of the destruction of the Congress, which we are facing today. And the one singular act by which he did it, again, has something to do with media and culture, and that was the prime time serialization of Ramayana on Doordarshan, on prime time. And that was a ritual for the millennial generation. You may not know this. It was nothing like any serial you're seeing on an OTT platform today, the most, the runaway serial. When Ramayana ran on prime time on Sunday mornings, the entire life in the city or the place came to a halt. Traffic stopped. It was like an India-Pakistan match. Is the closest, final match somewhere, the closest you could put to it. And people would worship the screen before the signature tune started. They would do aarti to the screen. And this is the level at which this is the body blow that Rajiv Gandhi delivered to the state electronic media, which until then was very, very consciously and scrupulously secular. This was a body blow of desecularization of the media, shall we say. And then there was no going back. The genie was let out of the bottle, as it were. And Ramayana was actually done by Rajiv Gandhi by calling, I mean, one can understand it if it was a sophisticated. Ramayana is a wonderful epic. I have no quarrel with Ramayana or Mahabharata. They are wonderful epics. They are great epics, which have great poetry and great imaginativeness, great creativity in them. But the version that was deliberately chosen, as we know, was the Tulsi Ramcharitmanas, which had an element of combativeness with Islam, because it was written in the context of the 13th century Muslim perception of Muslim invasion and threat. And as Romila Thapar has eloquently explained, this was a version. And I know that we know that Rajiv Gandhi actually called Ramanand Sagar, a Bollywood film producer, an average Bollywood filmmaker, mainstream film producer, and asked him to do this version of the Ramayana. And therefore, you got the cardboard cutout character of Rama, a transmuted Rama. Transmuted because, going back to Karuppadanna, one of my memories of my drawing of the main hall, of the drawing room, equivalent of the drawing room in our joint household there, was this calendar art, this Shivakashi calendar art, which I think is common to most South Indian homes, where you see the beneficent, the benign Rama and his, Sita and Lakshmana and Hanuman, where they are in the what you call the Udar pose, where he's blessing, where Hanuman is bending below his feet, and Lakshmana and Sita are on the side, and the whole image is one of pacifism. It's not one of uh, of belligerence. So you transmute that Rama and that imagery to one of belligerence. That is what this Ramayana did. So instead of that image calendar art, what you now get is the Rama who is stringing his bow and arrow in a perennial Digvijaya form. It's conquest. It's conquest of religion. It's conquest of the other. It's also othering and it's conquesting the other, of conquest of the other. So there was this whole cultural motive shift that was taking place, whose significance I think came far later, but this was happening in the 70s and the 1980s, and the and there was, I mean, these are shifts into post-truth, if you like, of a particular epic, and of the way it was received, the received cultural signification being flipped on its head, upended, and made to be the opposite, if you like. Um, and then, of course, through the 1990s, my experience was starting with the decade I had started AsiaNet, and AsiaNet, of course, was a cultural exercise for us, because for the making of AsiaNet was not a business proposition, because we thought if we had the interest and the enthusiasm and something to say, the money would come. We didn't know how shall we say, simplified or simplistic we had made it appear. The money was difficult coming. It was struggle. It was uphill, but it was wonderful because it was like a workshop. There were many of us who were engaged in it. Many of them are there. They are still around, and it was working. It was brainstorming sessions. It was deciding what to do, and I think the fare with which AsiaNet was started, the cultural identity of AsiaNet, was certainly one of intervention, one of renaissance, a new age renaissance was our credo, if you like. And the kind of programs that were done, whether it's Keralam, which was done by Chinda Ravi, was, I think, unprecedented. It kind of mapped the culture and society of Kerala at that time, from the northernmost to the southernmost point, over several hundreds of episodes. We had Kamala Das or Madhavi Kuti anchoring a program called Nammal Tamil, where she'd talk to people on issues. I don't even know where many of us remember some of these programs now. There was a Patra Vishesham, which was the first self-reflexive program on how the media is performing, how the press is performing, anchored by Paul Sakaria and Babu Bhaskar. There were programs where those in power were interacting with the people, a direct kind of interactive program, Mukhyamantri Odi Chodikyam, where Nayanar became a television star overnight because of his inimitable flamboyant ways and the way he'd field questions from the people who called in on telephone, right? There was nothing to it, just telephone calls. There was a video column or a television column, the equivalent of a television column. It's a new genre, if you like, at that time, done by EMS. 15 minutes, he talk once a week about one or the other issue. And these were all the programs which had nothing to do with what's happening around the world. I don't think these were programs which we were because these were created in the workshop that we spoke about, of like-minded people. And we had a lot of such programs. We also went against the grain of the media when we said that the ISRO spy case was a fabricated case, when every other media in Kerala was saying the opposite, or almost every other media. And the missing Maulavi. So these are all things one looks back with pride on. But I'm not here to actually enumerate the great achievements of AsiaNet. I'm saying this with a purpose because, and the news was also a part of it. News was not, there was no separate news channel then yet. We started that later. There was a news every 3 or 4 news bulletins in the course of a day. And there was a kind of way of looking at news. We initially actually wanted, although we didn't succeed in that, we said we should have news spoken in the dialect and in the regional language of people who come from the various places. If somebody from Kozhikode is reading the news, there should be a twang to that. There should be something different from the way someone reads news in Trivandrum. It shouldn't have this neutered, sanitized, textual, reading a text quality to it, which is like some official gazette being read, which continues to be the news reading style, not just in Kerala, but in India, to make it more conversational and not to be worried about the differences in the way you're using your language. I mean, the Ethnologue report of India says there are some 5,000 languages and dialects in this country. And the mainstreaming of news, the language that's used in news, has been responsible for marginalizing to almost eradicating, endangering many of these languages and dialects, because they are in disuse, or they are seen as less privileged, or they are seen as less important, or seen as infra-dig. So there was that as well. And so the culture of news and culture of programming in language and dialect and the orality expression were all things we wanted to do, but I'm afraid we didn't succeed too much there. And there were serious serials that were done by people like K.P. Kumar and with no or low budgets. I mean, low is a euphemism. There's literally no budget. We'd say, if you can find the money, do a serial and we'll show it. Because there was no money. And I remember, as a very quick anecdote, there was this wonderful young person called Sashi Kumar, who was from the Film Institute of India, who wanted to do a serial on MP Narayana Pillai's Parinama, which is about dogs, basically. And he said, I said, I have no money. So I don't mind disclosing it. Now, I said, all we can do is some 10,000 rupees per episode. He said, that's fine. I mean, normally they would at least bargain. He said, that's more than enough. And he went back and he came up with a fairly interesting serial. And how did he do it? Because he said, all I needed was street dogs who don't charge a fee. Then I needed some policemen, and I just took close shots so that I need to use only the top part. So I use the same uniform, the police top of the uniform and the hat. Depending on the inspector or the constable, I just have to change the hat. And so I had just 2 sets of that and these dogs, and my serial was done. Otherwise, I had no other. I needed a camera, which you gave us, so that's fine. So, I mean, just to give you a sense of how culture was being created in the most direst of circumstances. And there was a children's serial called Chiragal, which my wife Radhika actually did. She already had set up. She's a publisher, children's publisher. Their brand is it's Tulika, and so she did Chiragal. And one memory I have after in spite of all this, what brought us money were films and film-based programs, right? And we had perfected that to an art. We had bought up the rights of all the black and white films. And I had this theory that if you have the right to one film, you can run 5 hours of programming a day, which is as follows. You run 2 hours of the film itself, then you take all the comedy sequences and make a program called Comicola, which we did. Then you take all the fighting sequences and do a program of half an hour, which is about fighting. Then you take all the romantic sequences and talk about give it some title, which has a romantic flavor to it. Then you take all the songs and then so you get 5 to 6 hours of programming with just one movie. And if you have 6 hours of programming and you repeat it once over, it's 12 hours, and that's the time you can watch television. And for people who are not in some other time zone, they can see it once again in a loop. So 24 hours, 24/7 programming with one movie was perhaps one of our earliest inventions, because of the circumstances in which we had to invent, and be out of the box. Anyway. So, so Chiragal, in fact, we had to discontinue some of these programs, which meant a little more budget because, getting children to act. And so we had to stop Chiragal. And I remember a call that I got from father of one of the children. Chiragal used to come on every Saturday or weekends, Saturday or Sunday, I'm not sure, in the morning. And he called and said, how dare you stop a serial like that out of the blue without any warning? He said, my child is very distraught. She's not eating, she's refusing to go to school, she's not doing her homework, she's not being her normal self. You cannot just pull a program off the air as you like. It actually shook me because, so imagine the power of someone who says, imagine the power of something that you do on television and imagine what the kind of impact it has. And on the other side of the coin, imagine the power of a few parents like that who then decide to remonstrate and say, if you do this, we are going to boycott you. Imagine, this has been my argument about the need for media reform. We know that a section of the media, a dominant section of the media, is giving us trash, forget about the commodity fetish and so on. It is, they are consciously lying, they're capitulating, they are speaking untruth for power instead of speaking truth to power. And yet we gulp it, knowing that this is how it is. But the need for a media reform movement will only come when the consumers, when the beneficiaries or victims of such programming take it upon themselves to do something about it. Imagine if 100 people or 200 people remonstrated in front of a media organization for 2 weeks consecutively. It will shake the organization like nothing else. You don't need thousands of people like is happening in Burma now, or like is happening in the farmer situation in Delhi, because this has a multiplier effect. This has a multiplier effect which is far more dangerous as far as the media organizations who have nothing but profit maximization in mind are concerned. That was again an aside. And so, but all this whole fantastic sense of fulfillment and excitement and mission and adventure halted or reached a dead end with one serial called Stree. And that is the beginning of the serial in the Kerala context, at least. Stree became the first mega serial, and it acquired its own autonomous kind of role. And none of us could do anything about it. Those who are marketing Stree, the marketing department suddenly became more important than the producers, because Stree was bringing in the money to cross-subsidize. Even before that, it was the films and film programs. And with Stree, the bigger expenses, we were making better salaries, spending more on programs. You are cross-subsidizing an entire channel with just one program, with one serial. And that hasn't changed until this day. I mean, if you look at prime time, the idea of prime time being serials is because you need that money to cross-subsidize any other program which you think is far more important, far more valuable, far more socially conscious, far more culturally significant, and so on. And so you find the market model taking over. You find that the market model takes over. And for all that, Stree wasn't commodity fetishized in its form, at least. Unlike the serials today that you see, I mean, because it was the first form, and naturally it had to get worse and worse. If you look at the serial today, the average serial in Malayalam today, across any channel, forget about the plot or the theme and so on, which seem to keep people on edge at homes. The very visible element is commodity fetish, right? They're all dressed to kill. They're all in the finest jewelry. They're all wearing pattu saris and lovely dresses, as if they're all waiting to go out for a marriage or a birthday party. But it's pure domestic. They just slept and come out with this kind of dress. They're cooking in the kitchen with this kind of dress. So because the consumer, the advertiser is dictating the frame, the look and feel of the frame. It's not just the content, not just the plot, not just the way the narrative unfolds. The look has to fetishize commodity, has to fetishize jewelry, has to fetishize a sari, has to fetishize those consumer durables or those items of conspicuous consumption. Maybe a refrigerator, maybe an oven, maybe a car, maybe a motorbike. So this cultural product that there was the Frankfurt School, there was Adorno and Horkheimer speaking to you, in each of these serials. This is the inexorable logic that I realized with Stree. You give up. That's when you give up, and the logic, the inexorable logic of the market takes over. And so that is how the electronic era comes to a segues, shall we say, dovetails into the digital era. Meanwhile, you have many things happening. You have Francis Fukuyama happening. You have his idea of the end of history and the last man. The idea that liberal democracies have reached a self-perpetuation stage. Of course, that is not true, and I think he himself realized that. And his subsequent realization, as he wrote, I mean, his latest book, or in 2018, I think, was about identity, right? So we have lapsed back into identity politics. The liberalism is on the back foot across the world. We have moved from the analog to the digital, and the digital is an entirely new cultural game, as it were, because it privileges a whole host of new factors. From depth, you move into breadth. It privileges flatism. It privileges speed. of the Marinetti kind, the new aesthetic called speed, said Marinetti at the turn of the last century. You see that happening. It privileges the non-linear over the linear. It privileges multimedia, of course, and it privileges, I mean, and there's convergence, there's multimedia. Your written, your spoken, your seen converge on the screen. And it creates a new, we stopped at multinational capitalism in the Frederick Jameson template. Here's a new category with digitalism. That's the digital capitalism. A capitalism, the size and nature, so the obscenity of which, the obscene levels of which are unprecedented. The kind of the kind of money that digital capitalism, the capitalism that it creates, the accumulation that digital capitalism creates is unprecedented. And you find the commodification happening in the internet as well. You find it's driven by algorithms. It's a tyranny of algorithms. You find that every time, as I said, you click or you like something, you're producing data. You find definition of production being redefined. You're not a producer. You're a producer and a consumer at the same time on internet. You're a producer because there's user-generated content. You're producing every time you click and so on. You're also consuming, right? So and then it's a term for the internet called prosumers, combination of producer and consumer. Prosumers, the idea of prosumers, commodification reaches a different kind of level. There's a big break with the analog world. Digital is seen as a departure, not just a continuity, but a total break from the analog culture, from the analog sense of the cognitive and so on and so forth. So much so that we are looking at whether even Marxist theory needs to be upgraded, whether you need a post-Marxist kind of understanding in order to come to terms with the digital, because the idea of base and superstructure doesn't seem to apply here. You only have superstructure. Where is the base in this kind of context? The conventional idea of the political economy doesn't seem to apply. You don't have a sense of historical materialism acting in this kind of sphere. And therefore you need to reinvent, reimagine the core principles and cardinal values of Marxism. And this is one of the biggest, I think, shifts that have taken place. I find that I've already taken about an hour, and although I had a lot more to talk about digitalism, perhaps we can come to it in the course of the interaction. So I'm going to wind up by saying that this has been my my travel and my gleanings of the cultural, in a sense of a cultural sweep over the last 50 years or so, from the 1960s up until now. And I call them intimations of post-truth because in all of this, what is post-truth, of course, is up in the air. The jury is out. There's no definition of post-truth yet. It is propaganda, it is lie, it is alternate reality. It could have something to do with the Rashomon effect. Different people see the same event in different forms. Is that post-truth? Is it proto-fascist in the sense that, or Nietzsche says, the history of truth is the history of the longest lasting lie. In that sense, is it if you keep on repeating a lie like Trump tried to get away with, does that become post-truth? Or is it silencing truth? When truth should be told and you don't say the truth, is that a situation of post-truth? As Yevtushenko so eloquently said, when truth is replaced by silence, that silence is a lie. When truth is replaced by silence, that silence is a lie. Or is it like Plato, I think, long before all this said, a situation where you cannot come to truth, idea of truth in the realms of media or communication. You have to see it in terms of art and culture. Plato said poetry, famously, poetry comes closer to vital truth than history, because you can write dreams and dreams of history. It will be the story of the victor. It will be a lie because it's only the viewpoint of the one who was vanquished, not the viewpoint of the vanquished. And therefore, poetry in a haiku poem, in 4 lines, in a sculpture, in a painting, in one swift folio of abstraction, you perhaps glimpse at the vital truth. So I'll leave it there. And as far as Karuppadanna is concerned, my engagement with Karuppadanna continues online now. And I'm happy to report that as we speak, we are in the process of building a Vayana Shala, which is defiantly against this torrent of digital technology and digital culture. And as I said, I'm happy my Twitter handle continues to be Karuppadanna. Thank you very much.